Jerusalem, the Contested City. Lecture 4. Jews and Greeks in Jerusalem.
When we ended the last lecture, the Jews had returned from Babylonia from their captivity there, or their exile, back to Judea. They had rebuilt the city. They had constructed a new temple on top of the Temple Mount. A new temple, but not nearly so grandiose as Solomon's, which it replaced. And they tried to pick up the pieces of a Jewish life in Judea. One major change that had occurred, of course, was this was no longer an autonomous political existence. The Jews who lived in Judea were part of the Persian province of Yehud. And so they had foreign sovereigns, and they will have foreign sovereigns for many, many centuries during Jewish history. This is just the beginning of that experience. We have also, from a point of view of what our sources are, where we get this information, we've left the Bible behind. We've passed through the last historical books of the Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah, and we have come out the other side. And so what we're using from now on are other kinds of sources. Notably, for what is unfolding here, two types: the books of Maccabees and the historian Josephus. A word or two about the books of Maccabees. The books of Maccabees were produced by a dynasty that we'll see a lot more about shortly, called the Hasmoneans, and it's their propaganda to the great outside world of Jews of the time to try to gain some sort of authenticity for themselves. The books of Maccabees, the various books which bear that title, never made it into the Jewish Bible, right? So they are what are called apocrypha. However, and this is one of the little anomalies of the Christian and the Jewish views of the Bible, the Christians did include the books of Maccabees in their copies of the Bible. And so, from one point of view, the Maccabees are apocryphal books, and from another point of view, they are in the Bible. But we will take the Jewish point of view here. These are apocryphal books. These are non-biblical books, these books of Maccabees. And Josephus is a Jewish historian who died about the year 100 of the Common Era. And so he's writing about the past, 200 or 300 years previously. He has good information, and he is a professional historian. So we can set about trying to figure out what's going on in the city of Jerusalem. The Iranians allowed the Jews, as I say, to come back to Judea, and where they now serve as the vassals of these Persians. We don't know a lot about this period. Persian sovereignty over the Jews lasted roughly from 500 BCE down to 300, but those 200-odd years are rather obscure to our view. However, in 300, roughly, I'm rounding off some of these dates. The chronology, one has to keep it roughly straight, but it's not, the exact dates are not of great concern here. But in the 300s is the era of Alexander the Great, this famous conqueror, who led a kind of crusade through the Middle East. He was avenging earlier Greek defeats at the hands of the Persians, or as we are now taught to call them, more effectively the Iranians. And in the course of this, the entirety of the Middle East, all the way from Egypt out to what is today Pakistan, became his empire. He didn't live long enough to enjoy it. He died, still a very young man, in close to what is today Baghdad, after taking a swim in the Euphrates. And the Near East was divided up among his generals, and one general became the ruler, the king, the pharaoh in Egypt. His name was Ptolemy, and another named Seleucus, another general, became the king in Syria. And there was Palestine, the Eretz Israel, in between the two of them, as usual, between two superpowers, now, as it turns out, Greek superpowers. And so these two forces, these two kingdoms, Egypt and Syria, are going to fight over the land of Israel. The Egyptians will control it from 300 to 200, and the Syrians roughly from 200 on. But more important than that, and I will get back to the political side of this, the Jews of Eretz Israel are confronted for the first time with a new kind of threat, which can be called generically Hellenism. And intellectually, Hellenism is a worldview that regards human beings as capable, without any benefit of revelation or God sending his word to them, of figuring out about the existence of God and the nature of God and how the universe works and what's the place of humanity in the universe and the role of human beings to achieve happiness. This is what the Hellenes thought that individual humans could figure out for themselves. Now, for a revealed religion where all of these questions are answered by God and are preserved in Scripture, this is an enormous kind of challenge to the religion as it is today. It has different names, but it's the same deal. That where do you get the truth from? Do you get it from science, philosophy on the one hand, or do you get it from the revealed Word of God? And the conflict still exists. Under these Greeks, whether the Ptolemies of Egypt or the Seleucids of Syria, the Jews were accorded a certain number of privileges, rather extraordinarily. These people, the Greeks, realized, as later the Romans did, that they were dealing with a rather unusual people. The Jews had customs, religiously based customs, obviously, that prevented them from participating, to put it politically, participating fully in the life of the political entities under which they lived. And they could be coerced into participating into these, or simply excluded by reason of their inability to do so, to put it in general terms. So that one of the classic instances, for example, is the need to worship the sovereign. These sovereigns were deified generally, and that the citizen was expected to show solidarity with the sovereign, or loyalty, it's almost like a form of loyalty oath, by offering sacrifice to the sovereign. Now, for the ordinary Egyptian, the ordinary Syrian, this represented no problem, but for the Jew it did, obviously, the monotheistic Jew. But among the privileges that the Jews got was they were exempt from that sort of thing. The rulers understood, in a rare show of understanding and tolerance, that the Jews were different. They didn't admire this, by the way. They thought this was superstition. But what the heck? If that's the way they are, that's the way they are, and there was clearly no bending them. So they were exempt from all sorts of things by reason of their religious convictions, including some taxes, even, that they didn't have to pay. And their Greek rulers agreed, on the other hand, that they would supply money and resources for the upkeep of the temple and for the sacrifices in the temple. So there was an accommodation that had been worked out between the rulers and their Jewish subjects. So under this Hellenic sort of veneer, there is Jewish life that is going on. But there are other things at work here, not just the intellectual challenge to the Jews that came from Hellenism, but there's also a kind of political and lifestyle challenge from Hellenism. Because what the Greeks brought politically was a series of very new ideas, which doesn't challenge Judaism so much as a religious system, but certainly challenged it as a political system. And this idea, political Hellenism, is the view that humans are capable of self-government, that they should be autonomous, that sovereignty belongs to the people, and that inside these city-states, or polis, a polis is a Greek city-state, it's the basic unit of municipal self-government, that the citizens, the polites, as they were called, should govern themselves. They should elect their own officials, they should have an assembly, they should have a city council, they should have magistrates, they should have judges, they should have all the officers that we associate with a city, and that they should exercise their autonomy through the vote, etc., etc. The process, close to the process of what we call representative democracy. The difference being that the citizen body was a relatively restricted one. To be a polites in this system, to be a citizen, as we would call it, one had to be a male, an adult male, free, slaves need not apply, and also there were certain property qualifications for this honor. At any rate, to be a polis, to have a city as a polis, was clearly a mark of high status in the Middle East. The Greeks founded lots of new cities, which they frequently named after their rulers. So that in Egypt, for example, the largest city in Egypt was Alexandria, named after the man himself. And the capital of Greek Syria was a place called Antioch, or Antiochus, Antiochia, named after the ruler Antiochus. And so these were large cities with built in the Greek style, with Greek officers and Greek methods of government. And so it came to pass that as Hellenization began to affect and assimilate some of the Jews, the upper classes of Judea became progressively Hellenized. They adopted Hellenic ways. They remained Jews. I mean, they didn't defect to the other side. Some did, of course. Some just said, I'd rather be Greek than Jewish. But even those who remained Jewish, who identified themselves as Jews, who continued to observe the law, began to assimilate to this Hellenic style, much in the way that Americanism has affected the lifestyles of lots of people. And a move was eventually made among the upper classes to have Jerusalem declared a polis, to move its status upward, right, into and become, in effect, a Hellenic city. Now, only the king could grant this privilege, and there was the exchange of a great deal of money and influence. The high priests were sort of influential here. They were the ones who were negotiating this whole thing. To give you some idea, by the way, of a very superficial idea of the Hellenization process, the high priests of this period, the Jewish high priests of this period, were named Jason and Menelaus, which gives you a kind of clue of what exactly was going on there. At any rate, they had their way. They prevailed upon the king in Antioch that he should declare Jerusalem a polis, and indeed he did. And so Jerusalem became officially Antioch in Judea. That's to distinguish it from all the other Antiochias. This is Antioch in Judea. And the first act is to have a census, and the function of census is not like our own to establish demographic data, but to establish income data, people's incomes, so that the citizen roll could be drawn up, which it was. The list of citizens was compiled of this new polis called Jerusalem, and it was, as I say, the upper classes, the most assimilated to Hellenism, the richest, etc., which meant, in the consequence, that a great many Jews were disenfranchised in their own city, in their own land, which, of course, began to create enormous social and class tensions in this place. But not only that, Jerusalem began to take on the trappings of a Greek city. So they were introduced into the city all the kind of institutions and typical establishments that characterize a polis. So that there was a theater in Jerusalem, and there was a racehorse course, and there was a gymnasium. The Greeks had this notion of a sound mind and a sound body. And so all of these processes, all of these institutions, all of these kinds of things began to show up in Jerusalem, in the new Antioch in Judea, much to the chagrin and the scandal of traditional Jews. And both Josephus and the Maccabees sort of paint a rather vivid picture of life in Jerusalem under the new, quote, Americanization of Jerusalem. And, of course, the books of Maccabees know how this is going to end. It's going to end in a revolution against this. And so they construe this as the godlessness of the Greeks coming in and overwhelming the godly Jews. As a matter of fact, this was something that was attracting many Jews. There was no imposition of this. This was a self-inflicted kind of wound. If it was a wound, it was the attraction of modernity. I mean, that's to put it quite simply, that's what it was. And so we have pictures, and Josephus, of course, is a little more sober. The books of Maccabees sound a lot like a Puccini opera. There's a lot of highly melodramatic and very tuneful kind of stuff. But Josephus is a little more measured in his description of this because, after all, he himself is, in effect, an assimilated, Hellenized Jew. These works that he's writing are works written in Greek. And so his view of these things, not that he necessarily approved of some of the stuff, among other things, for example, is the nudity that really scandalized lots. The gymnasium, among other things that the Greeks introduced into the world of the Middle East, is athletics. Nobody had not occurred to anybody to really indulge in games before. That's an upper class activity, obviously. peasants throughout the world are not much taken by games. There's not a lot of time, first of all. Education, skole, school, is another one. Skole, the very word tells where that's coming from. Skole is the Greek word for leisure, so it's, again, an upper-class thing. But it's the nudity, the gyms, Josephus tells us that even some Jews had gone to the extent of having their circumcision cosmetically covered up. Right? There was an operation that had been developed, original plastic surgery procedure to conceal circumcision, because if you're going to remove your clothes and run, that's an extraordinarily bad idea, by the way. Naked athletics seems to be just a non-starter, but we have the Greeks to thank for that. This sort of existence of Jerusalem as a Greek city did not last terribly long, and it got caught up in the politics between Syria and Egypt. The ruler who provoked this is a man named Antiochus, naturally. All these Syrian rulers are named either Antiochus or Seleucus, like all the Egyptian rulers are all named Ptolemy, if they're males. If they're females, they have an option. They can call themselves Cleopatra, but she's of that family, by the way. She's the end line of those Ptolemies in Egypt. At any rate, we're talking about Antiochus, who, to distinguish him from the others, is called Antiochus Epiphanes. At the very beginning of these lectures, I mentioned the word theophany as a supernatural apparition, a divine apparition. Well, epiphany means the same thing. Epiphanes means the God made manifest. So there is Antiochus Epiphanes. We know a lot about him from other sources, from Roman and Greek historians, and he was a rather erratic gentleman, to say the least. But he is the man in charge, and he has to deal with the Jews, and he suspects that the people of the province of Judea, of his empire, have been conniving behind his back with his enemies in Egypt, with the Ptolemies. And so there's a war zone. It's between these two kingdoms. And he accuses them of treachery, of political treachery, and comes down very hard on the Jews. There begins under Antiochus Epiphanes, who rules from 175 to 164 before the Common Era. There breaks out a widespread persecution of the Jews, and significantly as Jews. So it's not simply a question of removing the privileges of Jerusalem, which he did. He cashiered the city back to sort of a military colony. He put in a garrison, which is the ultimate kind of municipal abuse, right? To put a garrison of foreign troops into your city, put it and declared it under martial law, in effect. But he also had burned copies of the Torah. He knew what he was about. He understood that the Jews were a religious community as well as a political one. And he put up on the Temple Mount somewhere, he built a grandiose altar to one of his gods. This has attracted particular attention because there is a reference in what is the very last book of the Bible, the book of Daniel, which is cast in the form of a prediction after the events, obviously, of something that's called the abomination of desolation that will strike Jerusalem. The abomination of desolation, that dramatic phrase, refers to this altar that Antiochus Epiphanes erected on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Well, all of this provoked a reaction from the Jews. The Jews had already revolted against their masters, the Babylonians, which led to the destruction of the city back in the 6th century BCE, and they revolt once more against their oppressors, the Greek Seleucids of Syria. And this revolt is led by a kind of minor priestly family that goes under the nickname of the Maccabees. The Maccabee is not their real name. It means the hammer. Maccabeus is hammer. And so that's Judah. The Maccabee is Judah the hammer. So that's their nickname. What their real name was, the family name was the Hasmoneans. They descended from a man by the name of Hasmon. So they're called the Hasmoneans in a more formal sense. At any rate, these Maccabees, to use their original term, led a revolt, a kind of guerrilla warfare against the Seleucids all through the middle 160s of that 2nd century BCE. And extraordinarily, it was successful. The Seleucids had entered into a period they had overextended themselves, probably. The kingdom was too big. It was coming apart at the seams. And in a sense, the Maccabees were opportunists in that they had struck at the Seleucids at an opportune time, and the Seleucids, in effect, had to yield. And so this Maccabean revolt, which begins in 166 and continues down for a couple of years, in the end is at least partially successful. I say partially successful in that these Maccabees, under their now dynastic name of the Hasmoneans, managed to institute an independent dynasty in Judea, that in this land, this Eretz Israel, there is once again a Jewish state, right? The kingdom of the Hasmoneans. Now, just call it an independent state is to be a little bit misleading, because they still were tributaries, in effect, of the Seleucids. They didn't take their place on the Security Council of the Fertile Crescent by any means. They were clients of the Seleucids, and the Seleucids granted them, but it granted them that at least that degree of independence where they had their own king once again. So these Hasmoneans now were the rulers of the kingdom of Israel, a new kingdom of Israel. And the most significant event of the reign of the Hasmoneans is their purification of the temple in the year 165. The Greek garrison was driven out of, well, I'm not sure about the Greek garrison being driven out, but the temple itself was purified. The altar, the abomination of desolation, was removed. The priesthoods resumed their functioning as the rulers of the Temple Mount, and this was celebrated by a feast, the feast of the purification of the temple, or Hanukkah, as it came to be called, which celebrates that event and is surrounded by its own sort of mythological set of stories that are current, that remain current among the Jews. Interesting thing about Hanukkah is that it becomes a Jewish, holy day, holiday, national feast day, because of the propagation through the books of the Maccabees. That's part of the story that the Maccabees are telling in these books. But these books are not in the Bible, as I said, not in the Jewish Bible. And so, in a way, Hanukkah is not a biblical holy day. It's not like Passover. It's not like Sukkot. It's not like Shavuot. Right? It's not like Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah. It's a post-biblical holiday, which has been taken up and practiced by many Jews, but it doesn't have any sort of biblical warrant. The reason why these Maccabees, these books are in the Christian Bible and not in the Jewish one, among other reasons, is that the Maccabees were attractive to the Christians because they were prototypes of martyrs. Right? They were sort of the ideal martyrs among the Jews. These were people who were willing to put their life on the line for their faith and their belief system. And so that trait of them passed down into Christianity and made them much admired. So they become figures in sort of early Christian cult. And that, as I say, is one of the reasons why the books of Maccabees still show up in Christian versions of the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, but not in the Jewish versions. To get back to the Maccabeans, or the Hasmoneans, as they're now called, they rule Jerusalem pretty much from 161, when they assume the kingship, down for roughly about 100 years, because at the end of this, in 63 before the Common Era, the Romans arrive, about which I will say something shortly. The Hasmoneans are interesting, a series of kings who also, oddly and uniquely in Jewish history, are also the high priests of the temple. I mean, this is very rare, that the combination of these two offices. It's a strange combination because the two institutions are really quite separate. They weren't really descendants of Aaron, so there's a problem about their priesthoods. Right? So one of the characteristics of later Judaism of this period onward, the second, first century, about which we have increasing pieces of information, is the sectarianism that sets in among the Jews. And one of the issues, sectarian issues that separate Jews, are their views of the temple, what's going on in it, and who's running it. So there is a cloud that begins to settle over the priesthoods in post-exilic Judaism, and part of that cloud has to do with the usurpation of the office. That's a very strong word, and perhaps it's too strong, but there were doubts about the office as manifested, as exercised by the Hasmoneans, let us say. So the temple priesthoods and the temple generally speaking, becomes part of the issue that troubles Judaism of this period. And the other thing about the Hasmoneans, these kings of Israel, is that they too become progressively, they as we would put it, they came into office on a platform of anti-Hellenism. Right? These were God's people fighting against the godless Hellenic kings of Syria, the Greeks of Syria. But as a matter of fact, there was only one way for a ruler to rule in the Middle East in the 2nd century BCE, and that was in the Hellenic fashion. That was the only style really available. And so the Hasmoneans, as time went on, themselves became Hellenized. That's the style they took on. They didn't become pagans. They became Hellenized. They adopted the Hellenic style of dress, of nomenclature, of tombs, etc. What we can tell about them is that they lived the Hellenic life in Jerusalem. They built their palace in the city, and this progressive Hellenism on the part of the Hasmoneans, of course, provoked a reaction that they had themselves set in train. By making Hellenism an issue, they now were caught on their own issue. And so there begins to show up among Jews people who are called Hasidim, or pietists, who are opposed to these Hasmoneans. There are also this sect, or this group of the Pharisees, which also becomes politically involved against the Hasmoneans. And so this Hasmonean dynasty begins to find itself in increasing trouble as time goes on. And the trouble becomes even more serious by a peculiar little event toward the end of this. The king, the Hasmonean king named Alexander Jannaeus, another example. How's that for a Jewish name, Alexander Jannaeus? It's Alexander Yannai. Yannai is okay, but Alexander, he dies, and his wife Salome becomes the king. Right? She is not just the queen mother; she's the king of Israel, a female king. But what she can't do, although she can assume the title of king, what she cannot do is assume, obviously, the title of high priest. And so the high priesthood becomes the sort of political football between her two sons. And this sets up this very awkward kind of situation of factions developing in the Hasmonean family, pro and con one son or the other. This is a very bad time to have family troubles, because on the scene for some time, has been a very looming presence out there who has been making growling noises. You can hear, on a quiet night, you can hear the growling. This is the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic at this point, but the Roman power in Italy has become, in effect, a superpower, one of the players, and it has become one of the players in the Middle East. So whatever the Ptolemies are doing in Egypt, and we know about the story about Cleopatra and her little brother, and whatever is happening in Antioch among the Seleucids, the real masters out there, the real presence, are these Romans. They are intervening, first indirectly, in the political lives of all these polities in the Middle East, even in the insignificant polity of the kingdom, this little kingdom of Israel. And they back one client, one brother or the other, until finally the Romans have had enough. And in 63, they intervene in this struggle, this quarrels that are going on in Judea. And a Roman army, under the leadership of one of their famous generals, Pompey, comes to Jerusalem and takes the city and enters, like most people who have had this opportunity, wants to see the temple and wants to see that inner sanctum, that inner place called the Holy of Holies, and is astonished, as other people have been, to go in and find it's an empty room, essentially. Because, as I've already described, one of the characteristics of the temples of the ancient world is that they were understood really as the houses of God, that God lived inside the temple. People in the ancient world didn't worship inside temples. They're not like synagogues or churches, right, where the services go on inside. The inside of temples, of ancient temples, is where the God lived, and the God was represented by some effigy, some image of the God, and a highly anthropomorphized, realistic-looking image, very often, highly decorated, and there it was, and it sat inside, or stood, or sat inside the temple, and that the worship of God took place outside in the courtyard. The altars to the gods were outside the temples, not inside. Your church has its altar inside. An ancient temple had the altar outside. So where the priests made the sacrifices were outside, even including the temple in Jerusalem. The temple in Jerusalem had an inner chamber which had once had the Ark of the Covenant, now gone, so it's now just simply empty. But outside are the great altars, the great altar upon which this animal sacrifice is made. And the priest functioned in public. You could see them making the sacrifices, and the faithful, the congregation, as we might put it in more modern terms, stood and watched. And the God remained inside. Occasionally the effigy might be brought out in procession or something, but the God was inside. So Pompey, in 63, was rather astonished to find that inside this particular temple there was no effigy of the God. There was no figure that was to be seen. So now the Romans are on the scene, right? The Jews have had this moment, this 100-odd years of relative autonomy, we can call it, under the Hasmoneans. But from now on, Judea, and however large it gets or however small Judea gets, is going to be under a Roman shadow, and under a considerable Roman shadow, for hundreds and hundreds of years, as a matter of fact. So the fate, henceforward, the fate of the Jews, and their political fate and their religious fate, is going to be tied to the Romans, to Roman political will, and Roman attitudes about the religion. And we've already seen that the Jews were given exemptions and privileges by the Greeks. Well, to anticipate a little bit, these same privileges are going to be extended to the Jews by the Romans. But a great deal has to happen before those things begin to fit into place. The Romans still have to decide at this point exactly how closely they are going to maintain their control of Judea. Are they going to rule it themselves, or are they going to allow the Jews some sort of degree of autonomy, so that the main decision that rests on the table at this point is exactly how much freedom is to be granted to the Jews. Jerusalem at this stage, we don't have a lot of idea. We know now that some of the buildings that are in place there, we've had indications of palaces, indications of public buildings. We have some idea generally of the population of Jerusalem. And its size, its importance, is obviously in terms of its political importance as the capital of the Jews, but also it is the religious center of the Jews. Because one thing that is clear now is that a great many Jews live outside of Eretz Israel. More and more Jews are living abroad, not only in Babylonia, but throughout the Mediterranean. And so that Jerusalem specifically, right, is the focus and the center of a community which is not simply a political community in one specific place, but of an entire Mediterranean community, a religious community that is bound together by its worship of this one true God.
After listening to Lecture 4, a student posed this question to Professor Peters. How did the Jews resist Hellenism? This is how the professor responded.
The Jewish tactic, the counterculture tactic of the Jews against Hellenism, the resistance pattern of Hellenism, is something that goes deep back into Jewish history. It's the same one that was probably used initially. It's what God had in mind in giving the Torah to the Jews, namely to try to hold themselves separate, to separate themselves from the pagans, whether those pagans are ancient Canaanites or, in this case, whether they are the Hellenes. So during this period is the period of the rise of the Pharisees, whose position precisely was Holy equals separate. So the Pharisees advocated a policy of strict observance of the law, which would prohibit a Jew, prevent a Jew from eating with the Hellenes, or Gentiles generally, or having anything to do with them socially. So separatism, keeping separate, was the solution, was one of the counterculture tactics against Hellenism.
This ends Lecture 4. Remember to visit this course's webpage at www.modernscholar.com, where you'll find additional information about the lectures you just heard.